Hello, I'm Brian Shaitkin, Senior Economist with the Conference Board, and welcome to today's special webcast, Blue Collar Workers No Longer Singing the Blues, our examination of labor shortages among blue-collar workers, low-paid service workers, and how those labor shortages are playing into labor costs now and in the future for business. Some of the key questions that we're going to be addressing on this webcast include, for which occupations are labor markets currently the tightest? Is wage growth accelerating in blue-collar occupations? How will these trends evolve in the next year and in the next decade? And how should companies react to the looming blue-collar labor shortages from a strategic perspective, and how may this affect worker welfare over the next decade? As part of this webcast, you'll have the opportunity to earn 3 types of credits: HRCI, SHRM, and CPE. For all of these credits, please stay online throughout the entire webcast, and credit will be available only for live participation. Please also, during the course of the webcast, ask your questions. You can do that in the box below, and we will take those questions and answer them during the course of the webcast. It makes for a much more interactive experience, so please ask your questions during the course of the webcast. Joining me today, and appropriate for Halloween, dressing up also with blue collars, is first of all our Chief Economist North America, Gad Lebanon, who has been busily writing this report and leading research into this entire question of why is it that that there are greater shortages now for blue-collar work than we've seen in the past. So Gad, privileged to welcome you from the other side of the table today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Brian.
And also joining us, Associate Economist Frank Steemers, who has played an invaluable work in putting together a lot of the analysis that has gone into this report and helping us think about this question of why now is it that these blue-collar and low-wage service workers are doing so well in the present labor market.
Great. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Frank. So, Gad, the question, whenever one listens to discussions of education policy, the phrase college premium makes a frequent appearance. The idea that workers with BAs in an economy that's getting more complex, demanding greater fluency in STEM disciplines, in writing, in all of those types of college skills are going to benefit more and more from the way the economy is changing. Yet your report provides a counterintuitive conclusion that there are some occupations where requirements from employers typically do not include college degrees, but yet those are precisely the occupations experiencing the greatest labor shortages and at present the fastest wage growth. What explains this result?
Well, I would say, the determinants of education and the determinants of employment, in the long run, they match. But in the short run, there could be deviations. So in some cases, it takes employment in certain types of occupations is growing faster than the supply of workers. And what we are seeing now is that the growth in the share of people with a BA is leading to a shrinkage in the number of people without a BA. Those people are the ones that are consist of the majority of blue-collar and low-paid services jobs. But at the same time, the demand for those jobs is increasing quite rapidly. So there is a mismatch. Too many people in the US are getting a BA compared to the need for the jobs that don't require a BA.
So I think that discussion of how there is this mismatch is really important, and how there may be a lack of workers now with some of the skills that employers are most interested in hiring for. So how do you break down, how do you distinguish between those occupations in the blue collar category and those not in the blue collar category in this report?
Right. So what we call the pure blue collar are in construction, extraction, farming, fishing, forestry, installation, maintenance, repair, production, transportation, and material moving occupations. In addition to that, we group into the blue collar group also the low paid services, healthcare support, protective services, food preparation and serving, building and grounds cleaning, and personal care occupations. In both of those occupations, the share of people with a BA is extremely small. In the white collar occupation, we include management, business, financial, professional, which the large majority of those workers do have a BA degree. But we also include sales, office, and administrative support occupations. In those occupations, there are actually few people with a BA degree. So in some sense, those definitions are not written in the Bible. I think what we find is that the pressure and the wage growth that we are seeing is more in occupations that don't require a college degree than the ones that do.
No, that's a really important way of setting up this conversation. What are those occupations where labor shortage pressures are greatest? So what are the main themes in your report, and what are some of the key takeaways?
So as those who follow our work know that we've been talking a lot about labor shortages essentially since 2014, when it was more of a futuristic topic. Now in 2018, it becomes a reality. So we'll start with setting the stage at the national level. But kind of the twist to the overall story is that in the last year or so, we are seeing a much tighter labor markets for blue collar and low paid services than we are seeing for white collar. And this is not entirely intuitive, and it's certainly the opposite of the trends that we've seen in recent decades. So we'll spend some time explaining why that is the case. It has a lot to do with education, as we hinted before, but also to disability and perhaps other explanations. So we'll go through that. Then we'll make the point that we didn't hit the worst period yet. We expect labor shortages to be in blue-collar related workers worse a year from now than they are now. And unless we make significant breakthrough in automation and bring many more people from outside the labor force, this may become even a bigger problem in the next decade, because the trend of shrinking number of non-college graduates is only going to become worse in the next decade. And finally, we are a corporate membership organization, so we tend to focus on corporations, but it's important to say that labor shortages are a problem for employers, but they are very good for workers and employees. So we'll discuss some of the improvements that we are seeing in their situation towards the end of this webcast.
So Frank, given the extraordinarily low unemployment rates that we're seeing presently, what is happening to wage growth? This chart presents two measures of wage growth. What trends are we seeing right now?
Right, exactly. So maybe let me first say something about the unemployment rate. It is now at its lowest point since 1960. We see that it is lower than 2007. It is maybe now as low as it was in the late 90s. At the same time, because the labor force participation was higher in the late 90s, we can still discuss how tight is the labor market. Actually, is it already as tight on a national level? But we know it is tight, and especially when you later look in the slide deck, when we dig deeper into occupations, you can see that for some occupations, white-collar occupations, it's maybe not as tight yet. For blue-collar occupations, our case that we're making here, it's definitely tight. About the wage measures, we look here at two of the main wage measures, the average hourly earnings, that's the blue line. We look at the employment cost index, only the wages and salary component, that's the red line here. And you can clearly see that it is picking up, but still well below the levels that we saw, or the growth rates that we saw before the Great Recession, and for the ECI also the late 90s.
Now, when you describe the labor market as being tight, you make the distinction between how tight it is for these blue-collar and low-wage service occupations versus these other categories. How do trends in the unemployment rate by occupation category and comparisons back to 2007 illustrate this picture?
Right, so that is what we're showing in this chart. We're looking now only at the time frame 2015 to the last available data point, where we have now disaggregated the unemployment rate into 4 occupation groups. And interestingly, when we first look at the blue line, then we look at management, professional and related occupations. You saw that already in 2015, it was very close to the unemployment rate of 2007. But since then it has only slightly decreased and is now at the same unemployment rate in 2007. On the other hand, when we look at production, transportation, low-paid services occupations, so then you have to focus on the black line and the light gray line. You see that especially in the last 12 months or in the last 2 years, it has dipped very far below its 2007 rate. And this was a first indication for us, okay, maybe there's a story here, maybe there's a tale of 2 labor markets.
And I think that description of a tale of 2 labor markets is one that we'll talk a lot about during the rest of this webcast. But the question then becomes, as these shortages become more apparent, what does this mean for businesses trying to fill positions in their organization? How is their experience being shaped by the current low unemployment rate generally, and particularly for some of the occupational categories that we've been discussing?
Right, so another measure we very often look at is the survey conducted by the National Federation of Independent Business, and they survey businesses that are heavily skewed toward employment in blue-collar and low-paid service occupations. And we're showing here 2 of these measures, and as you can, for example, see in the blue line, you can see that about now 50% of businesses are reporting that they have only few or no qualified job applicants for their current job openings. And in the red line, you can see that firms have a lot of difficulties filling their position right now. It takes them longer and longer. And this is another indication that the labor market is getting tighter and tighter, and probably tighter and tighter for blue-collar and low-paid services occupations.
And I think your point about the fact that small businesses tend to hire exactly these categories, blue-collar and low-paid services workers, is extraordinarily important in illustrating this overall story of the 2 labor markets.
Yeah.
So
I should just, if we go back to this slide, I think it's important to note, well, 2 points to note. One is that we did note that the NFIB respondents are heavily skewed towards blue-collar employers. But the second is that in addition to recruiting difficulties, what we are also experiencing right now is a significant increase in the quits rate. So it's not only harder to recruit, it's also harder to retain workers.
And I think that retention point applies very much in terms of thinking about this story of 2 labor markets, because of course when a given population of workers is in high demand, the supply and demand dynamics become more favorable and there are more higher paying job opportunities out there. But I think the question businesses are asking is, recruiting is difficult now, but of course the economy is doing very well, the labor market is doing extraordinarily well. Is this really a problem that businesses have to think about on a long-term basis, or can they simply wait for a future recession to occur whenever that happens and assume that labor market conditions will begin to resemble those they saw in 2009 through 2013.
So, go ahead. Neil.
Yeah, okay, so I think in the short term, it is businesses already notice that they are running into problems in the long term, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. That in the long term, there's, at least from a demographics perspective, there might be very severe problems. But we're going to talk about more about that in a bit. What we, after having these indications about recruitment difficulties, about retainment difficulties, and unemployment rate that is especially low for blue-collar and low-paid service occupations, we started looking at some of the reasons. And one of them is that the supply is shrinking for the people that have normally always worked in these blue-collar and low-paid service occupations. And the first one is that the US population is getting more and more educated. And in itself, I would say that's a good thing. When people are getting better education, they can choose the job that they maybe really want to have. They can maybe get higher earnings, better benefits. At the same time, and that is what you can see in this chart, we see that the share of high school, some college, and the people with no high school degree, that share in the total population is shrinking, and that has always been the people that work in these blue-collar and low-paid service occupations. So a first important reason why the supply is shrinking. Another one, I would say, is, and that is something we have been looking at a lot, and that is the share of people not in the labor force because of reported disability. And we know that in the United States, on a national level, we have seen that since the mid-90s, this share has always increased over time. Now we see a small decrease, but around 6% on the national level in the working age population is reporting disability. Now we disaggregated this by education, and then the picture becomes pretty striking, and you see that especially for people that do not have a bachelor degree, the incidence of disability is much higher, especially for people without a high school degree, but also people with a high school, with some college. And this, again, are the people that have normally always worked in these blue-collar and low-paid service occupations.
And I think one question this chart raises is what's changed recently, because we could see that from 1994 to around 2014, disability rates among high school and some college workers were steadily increasing. But in 2014 and beyond, there is a flattening in those disability rates. What does that tell us about current labor market conditions?
Well, it tells us that there is some cyclicality. So there are people that say that they are not able to work because of, or not in the labor force because they believe they are disabled and cannot work, but actually when the labor market is getting tighter, also employers have to adapt, and perhaps they make it easier for people with disability to actually enroll into or to start employment. So that could be one reason, and something positive, that more and more people from this group are returning. Though when we look at the probability and we look at transition rates, we see that the share is still pretty small.
I would also say that it's probably to some degree also the decision of the worker. So disability is not either you can work or you cannot work. It could be that you're disabled to work in certain types of jobs, but there are jobs that you could do. If those jobs are available and there is a strong demand for them in your area, you may choose to get off disability and work in those jobs. So it probably reflects the improvement, the decline in the disability rates in the last year or so is probably reflection of the improved labor market conditions as well.
So labor market conditions are definitely improving for these some college and high school workers. How is the labor force, though, evolving in terms of educational composition? What is that going to mean in terms of future supply and demand dynamics by category?
Right. So what we see in this slide is the share of people in the labor force in different education groups. And we see the a very large increase in the share of people with a BA and above, and a decline in the share of people without a BA. And as Frank said, it's a result of two things. One, the US population is becoming more educated, but on top of this, it's also because the non-college graduates are much more likely to be on disability. This trend, as we'll show in a few slides, is likely to continue and even accelerate in the future. And that wouldn't have been a problem so much if we would have seen at the same time a declining demand for non-college graduates. But as we can see in the next slide, the demand for those jobs is actually rising. So what we see here is the employment shares by occupation groups. So if you look, for example, at the blue-collar occupation, which here appropriately is in blue, over the last several decades, it significantly shrinked in terms of share of total employment. But in this expansion, it's actually holding on to its share, meaning that it is growing as rapidly as the entire employment, as total employment. The same is true for the low-paid services in red. So while the supply of workers for those jobs is shrinking, the demand for them is continuing to rise as rapidly as the employment in general. So this creates a mismatch between supply and demand that is likely to get worse if we are not rising up to the challenge and do something about it.
So Gad, you raised some very interesting questions in this first part of the presentation, which is that we're seeing a labor force that is becoming more educated. At the same time, demand for these blue-collar and low-wage service occupations do not seem to be ebbing in any meaningful way. So the question becomes, how are employers to deal with this situation, and how long-lasting will these conditions be?
Right. So, as expected, I think in general employers prefer to raise wages as the last alternative. But we are seeing that wage growth is accelerating, as we'll show in the next slide. Actually, let's go for a second to the next slide. What we have here is wage growth for 4 different occupation groups. Let's start with the largest one, which is management professional and related in the red line here. That's close to 40% of total employment, but those are almost all of the high-paid workers in the economy are in that group. And this group is that we see very little acceleration in management professional and related over the last several years. In the other groups, we are seeing a significant acceleration in wages. So if you see, those charts are pretty similar to the chart that we've seen on the unemployment rates. And it's not surprising that employers are reacting to the tightening labor market with faster wage growth for blue-collar and low-paid services. But we think that this problem is only going to get worse. First, in our regular forecasting activities that we do, we look ahead through the end of 2019, and in this time horizon, we are seeing a strong U.S. economy. We're now growing in the last 2 quarters at 3.5% to 4%. We expect it to moderate, but still throughout 2019, we expect it to grow above trend, which means that employment growth is likely to continue to be pretty strong and tighten the labor market. Now, and I think that's an excellent question. At some point, we will have a recession, and during the recession, a lot of people would lose their job. Are we expecting this shortages issue to remain a problem after the next recession? So, if you think if demographics is an important factor here, and we think it is, then the demographic trends are pretty terrible. In the next decade, there will be almost no growth in overall working age population, but when you look at the projections by education groups, those without a college degree are actually going to shrink rapidly in the next decade. So the question of how big of a problem it is going to be in the next decade or so depends on how much automation, and particularly automation, can offset the demographic trends. This is very hard to answer, but this is going to be the crucial point here.
Right, and I think that's going to be a crucial driver of the long-term outlooks, or this question of what businesses are going to do. Gad made a start at talking about wage trends by occupation growth, but I want to come back to this slide to hear Frank's perspective. Particularly, what we're seeing right now is that low-paid service workers who are in the green line are experiencing the fastest wage growth among the four categories. But that was also true back in 2007, 2008. How much of this overall picture among the four employment groups the four occupation groups is cyclical, and how much of it may be structural?
Well, I would say with the low-paid services occupations, indeed it is currently also, it has the strongest growth rate. Before the financial crisis or the Great Recession, it also had the strongest growth rate. The difficult thing here is we don't know exactly when the next downturn is, so it could very well that this growth rate is only getting stronger. And as Gad mentioned, from a technological perspective, is there going to be more automation? Are businesses going to change their business processes? That is something that it's much more difficult to forecast, to know, but what we do know is from a demographics perspective, that it is very likely that it is not just now an issue, but that after the next downturn, after the labor market recovers again, that it probably will be again a problem for the low-paid services occupations.
Right, so this picture will definitely remain similar going forward. Gad, one question to you on this chart is, we see in recent quarters the sales and office categories have been experiencing high wage growth. As you mentioned earlier in this presentation, those are categories that do not necessarily require BAs as credentials. So are those jobs an exception for some reason, or are we going to see that jobs in those categories are going to continue, and it's going to be a bifurcation across just whether an occupation requires a BA or not in terms of how fast wages are growing in that particular job?
Yeah, I think probably to some degree the question is whether you need a BA or not, and whether people with BA are willing to work in those jobs. And it could be especially the sales part of the sales and office is really benefiting in periods where growth is exceptionally high, because a lot of their salaries are based on commissions, and the last 2 quarters have been much better than expected. So it could be that in sales we will see some moderation in wage growth in 2019, as if we are correct, there will be some slowdown in economic growth.
No, that's an excellent point, that there are sort of special cyclical factors that may be driving wage growth in some of these categories. One question I think a lot of businesses have is, what's happening to costs for businesses as a result of this increased wage growth, especially among some of the production and transportation occupations?
Right, you'd expect that when your cost is going up, that you have to pass some of the cost to the consumer or to the user, otherwise you're going to eat your profits. And what we're seeing, especially in the area of transportation, which is probably the ground zero of labor shortages at this point, especially truck drivers, we're seeing a significant increase in the producer price index. So those are the prices that producers pay for transportation and warehousing services. And a part of this very large increase is a result of gasoline prices, which increased during that time. But there's no doubt that some of it is a result of the increase in the salaries of truck drivers and transportation workers in general. One of my colleagues told me what I think is an amazing story, that he was driving in DC and he stopped behind a truck in the stoplight, and there was a sign at the back of the truck that said that drivers are needed, starting salary $130,000. So that shows that the huge increase that we're seeing in some of those jobs. It means that in 120,000 they are still not able to hire as many drivers as they needed. So when you have transportation costs growing at 7% a year, at some point you have to pass it to the consumers, or your profit margin will significantly decline.
So it's not just truck drivers that are experiencing fast demand growth. It's goods producing industries in general. What does this chart show here, and how does that show the shape of the way in which demand is growing in different labor market categories?
Yes, so the goods producing industries, which are mostly manufacturing, construction, and mining, in 2016 they almost had a recession. We had a lot of weakness there. A lot of it was driven by the mining crisis as a result of the drop in oil prices. But we see in the last couple of years a very strong acceleration in goods producing industries, and they are heavy employers of blue collar workers. So if that trend continues, we are going to see very strong further tightening in blue collar jobs during 2019.
So the present labor market is one where these production workers, low wage service workers, transportation workers are in particularly high demand. And then the question becomes, how is this story going to evolve in the future? And we have some questions that deal with this issue. I mean, one suggestion is that in addition to the fact that the population is evolving in such a way that you have more people with higher educational credentials, and I'll ask Frank in a moment to speak more about that, it's also true that blue-collar workers, especially in production and transportation workers, tend to have shorter careers than white-collar workers. So Frank, what can we expect about how the labor market will evolve going forward, and how talent in terms of different education categories will grow over time?
So this is what we have already been mentioning in this webcast, that from a long-term perspective, we all know that the working age population is going to slow down. That is a story that has been cited often in the media. What we did in this exercise, we looked not just at the working age population, but we divided it in the people with a BA and above, and the people without a BA. And so just that you understand the charts, first, the black bar charts, the black bars, they show the overall working age population growth. So we see that in the next decade, the growth rate will be around 1%, but this will be primarily driven by a big decline in the working age population for people without a BA. You see that in the last 5 years, that population already without a BA decreased with 1.4%, and we expect that this will only accelerate in the next decade. And the great thing about population projections is that it is, we of course don't know exactly how big a population will be, but we can say with quite some accuracy that this is very, very likely to happen. And so just to fully understand what we're talking about, a few slides ago we talked about the US population becoming more educated. So what is happening, you get 25 years old that are better educated, that enter the labor force, and you have people 55 to 65 years old. That group that was relatively less educated is now exiting the labor force, putting this this burden on the supply for available workers.
That's an excellent point, Frank. And Gad, one question about this chart and sort of the overall composition of the U.S. labor force going forward is about immigration. Already you've presented a chart in the past showing that the contribution of new immigrants to labor force growth was both relatively small, but at the same time, virtually all of the positive growth that we'll see in terms of native-born labor force growth population going forward. How does a possibly more restrictive approach to immigration policy shape this overall story?
Yeah, no, in a time when you need workers, fewer immigrants is not helping the cause. But I would make two more specific comments on immigration. One is that part of the trend of stronger education attainment in the US is a result of the change in mix of immigration. So in recent years, there's been fewer immigrants from Latin America and more immigrants from Asia, which tend to be more educated. So this kind of furthers the trend that we're seeing of the divide between the labor markets for college and non-college graduates. The second thing is probably in terms of what we've seen so far in immigration, the biggest impact was the restrictions on undocumented immigrants. We don't have clear statistics on that for obvious reasons, but anecdotal stories suggest that the labor supply of undocumented workers is probably smaller than it used to be. And we know in one of the studies, Brian, that you did last year, you showed that undocumented immigrants are extremely concentrated in blue-collar and low-paid services jobs, in agriculture, construction, cleaning and maintenance. That's where you see that. And there are already anecdotal evidence that it's hurting the supply of workers, definitely in construction. In California, agriculture, they are suffering significantly from that. So that I think furthers the shortages that we're seeing in blue-collar and low-paid services.
I think that's an excellent way of thinking about immigration in the context of these labor shortage dynamics. I should remind you that you can download the presentation using the file download prod in the bottom center of your screen. And Gad, what this next slide shows is the questions about what else is it that business can do in terms of thinking about how to deal with these labor shortages. So what advice would you give to companies and governments now experiencing these labor shortages?
Right. So in my opinion, if we had to rank them, I would definitely put automation as number one. Partly because if you think about immigration, the current administration and in the foreseeable future, we are not, I don't think we'll see a significant increase in immigration. And I think there are limits to how much more people we can get from the sidelines to join the labor market, given the magnitude of retirements that we're likely to see in the next decade. So I think automation is probably the number one option, and we'll talk more about it in a few slides. I think also we are seeing companies expanding their recruitment efforts. So we are seeing definitely employers lowering educational qualification and as a result increasing training. When we also have a few slides on that. We are also seeing certain blue-collar employers raising hiring of women to all-time highs, which is something we didn't expect to see at this stage, but we are seeing that pretty clearly. And also hiring more minorities. We're seeing now the unemployment rates for both blacks and Hispanics at all-time lows. So expanding recruiting efforts to groups that have less attachment typically to the labor market. We also, when possible, so a lot of those jobs, the location is not up to the employer. They have to operate where the customers are, but in manufacturing and sometimes warehousing, there is some discretion of where to locate operations, and we think that, and we'll have more work on it later, early 2019, on where there are areas with more labor availability, and are companies indeed moving to those areas. But that's certainly an option. And again, something that companies are already doing is raising compensation. And in many cases, we hear from our members, how can we deal with the shortage without raising compensation? And I think to some degree it's impossible if your competitors are raising wages. At some point you'll have to do that as well, or you'll see people leaving the company. So we are already seeing that, and we expect that to happen more in the future.
Gad, you mentioned automation. There's an awful lot of coverage about artificial intelligence, robotics, and how this is revolutionizing many of the occupations that you are stating are experiencing extreme labor shortages and, as a result, extraordinary wage gains. What are the occupations that are most likely to be automated in the future, and how is that process playing out right now?
Yeah. So I think not surprisingly, it is easier to automate a job that is done by a non-college graduate on average than one by a college graduate. And there are several studies in recent years that try to predict the probability of automation by occupation. And as you see here, all of the top ranked occupations are in jobs that typically do not require a BA degree. And many of them are in blue collar and low paid services. So in terms of potential, it seems like those are the jobs that are easier to automate. In reality, and if we look at the next slide, so what we have here is we look at in the red line total non-farm business sector, which is all employment except the farm sector. And the blue line is for manufacturing only. And what the lines show is the 32-quarter annualized percent change. So if just to emphasize here, so if you look at the blue line and you go all the way to the right to the second quarter of 2018, what that number, which is about 0, suggests that in manufacturing in the last 32 quarters, there was 0 growth in labor productivity, which is what you get out of how much output you get out of 1 hour of work, which is extraordinary, I think, given that just a little more than a decade ago, if you look at the 8 years ending in 2004, this number was 5% annually. So for various reasons, both in the total economy and particularly in manufacturing, there has been no growth in labor productivity. I think part of it was because during 8 years, most of those 8 years had extremely weak labor markets and a lot of labor availability, low labor cost, and in those conditions, there are fewer incentives to automate. But we are perhaps seeing some signs now that the labor markets are tighter, that there is a little more pressure on companies to automate, and we may be seeing the green shoots of some revival in labor productivity, although it is too early to celebrate that.
Yeah, but given the struggles companies are presently having with automation and the trends in labor force composition you're describing towards more educated workers, one question on the line is, why isn't that driving more reallocation of talent and sort of more interest among people coming out of school or entering the labor market for the first time in some of these blue-collar occupations? And is there anything that can be done to make some of these jobs more attractive?
I think this would be a very important solution, if possible, is how to kind of either remove the stigma out of some of those manual labor jobs, that more people are willing to do it, or somehow reconstruct the job in a way that it requires more skills, and more people with a BA would find that a promising career move. I don't know how much companies are doing it at the moment. There's certainly been upskilling of many jobs, especially in manufacturing job right now is not on average the same as it was 10, 20 years ago. So I think that's something that companies should be more proactive about in making the job more appealing to people with a college degree.
One thing companies, though, are being proactive about, Frank, is thinking about how to revise their credentials for some of these positions. What does this chart show us about how credential requirements are changing among companies?
Right. So one solution could be to downskill, as we often say it, so to lower the entry requirements to start a job. So we asked ourselves the question, okay, what is happening to this young group, the 16 to 21 years old, from which we know they don't have experience yet, so they are very dependent on those education qualification. Do we see that people with a high school degree or below, that they can, in a tighter labor market, better compete or find employment, and that employers don't choose the people anymore with some college? So that is what we did in this exercise. So you see in the 94, 67% of people, of the people aged 16 to 21 years old had a high school degree or below that were working in the blue collar and low paid services occupations. And since the 2000s, this has been on a steep decline, but we see in the last 3 years that there's a small pickup. So companies are deciding, okay, maybe I don't need someone that has some college, maybe I don't need someone that has the strongest qualifications. Maybe we can actually hire those with just a high school degree or a high school degree or below. Yeah.
Right, and what's happening to unemployment rates for workers who don't have a high school degree as a result of some of these upskilling, not downskilling trends you're observing?
Right, I think we see it across the board that on a national level the unemployment rate is low, but we see it also for the people that do not have a high school degree. More and more people are entering the labor force and are finding a job.
No, absolutely. And the question then becomes, given these issues around downskilling, Gad, what is happening to the ability of firms to find talent?
Yeah. So digging further down in the resume pile and hiring less qualified workers is not a free lunch. And as a result, more employers are viewing labor quality as a bigger problem. What we see here, it's again a survey from the National Federation of Independent Business, where they ask every month the respondents, what is your most important business problem? And what we show here in this chart is the share of people who say quality of labor is our biggest problem. And this is now at historical highs. It's also the number one problem that now those respondents are saying. So it's not just finding enough people, it's finding enough qualified people. And how do you deal with a situation where the workers are not qualified enough?
And in order to find qualified blue-collar workers, how are companies changing their strategy in terms of hiring?
Yeah. So one thing they're doing, and that was a bit of a surprise for us, is that they are turning more to women. So in very male-dominated industries like transportation and construction, where most of the recruits are men, we are seeing in the last couple of years a significant increase in the share of women. In the transportation industry, that's the red line, we're seeing a jump from about 18 to 22% in the ratio between women to men in this industry. And we're also seeing a smaller but also sizable increase in construction and extraction occupations. So when companies are struggling to recruit in general, they move to populations that they typically do not recruit. And I gave a presentation yesterday in the Navy, and I learned there that there are now women also in the Navy SEALs. So I think if a woman can be in the Navy SEALs, she can also drive a truck. So there's certainly more potential for women in those types of jobs.
So is this broader perspective that employers are using to hire for some of these positions, is that helping to control wage growth trends in these occupations?
Well, as we showed before, there's still acceleration in wages in those occupations. One typical solution that companies turn to when recruiting is difficult is going to outsourcing and staffing firms. But what we are seeing now is that a lot of the workers in outsourcing and staffing companies would rather have a regular full-time job. So now in a stronger labor market, they are indeed finding those jobs, and the supply of workers in staffing and outsourcing companies is shrinking, and that's why we see even faster wage growth. What we see in this chart, the blue line is the wage growth for all blue-collar workers. The red line are wages for blue-collar workers in administrative and support services. So those are the outsourcing and staffing companies. There we are seeing faster acceleration in those. So the solution of going to outsourcing and staffing companies is becoming more expensive.
So what does it mean for workers that there is a situation emerging where employers are having more and more difficulty staffing these blue-collar and low-wage service occupations? There is a shrinking supply of those workers simply because the U.S. population, and in particular the 20 to 64 group, is becoming more educated. How is that shaping an experience for a group of workers that have really struggled over the past 3 or 4 decades in terms of achieving wage growth? And is this a circumstance that's likely to persist going forward?
So I think we are perhaps seeing a turning point for those workers. They did suffer greatly in the recent decades, and now the labor shortages in those occupations are improving their situation. So if we go to the next slide, we see that we also at the Conference Board run a job satisfaction survey, and there has been an increase in overall job satisfaction in recent years, but we also broke it down to workers in or low-income households and high-income households, where the threshold is 75,000 income for a household. And we see that the blue bars are the ones for the lower-income households. So obviously they are not as satisfied in their jobs as the higher income households, but we are seeing much faster growth since 2011 in the satisfaction of those low income households, which I think is in line with what we are seeing in terms of the shortages and labor market tightness for different groups of workers. We are also groups of minorities that are typically less attached to the labor force. We are seeing huge improvements there, which adds to the societal impact of this trend. If we look at the Black and Hispanic unemployment rates, they are now at historical lows, the lowest since we started recording these statistics. And finally, perhaps the long-run trend of increasing wage inequality is coming to a turning point. So what we see here is in the blue line, the ratio between the 10th and the 90th wage percentile. The red line is the ratio between the 25th and the 75th wage percentile. Over the several decades, those lines were going down, meaning that the poor were becoming poorer compared to the rich, at least when it comes to wages. But in recent years, we're perhaps seeing a turning point there, which is again in line with what we've been talking about here, that a lot of the low paid services and blue-collar workers tend to be at the bottom half of the income or wage distribution. So if they are getting paid more and their wages are moving faster, we should expect to see a turning point in wage inequality. It's important to know that this is just wages. There are other determinants of income, and there are certainly the situation in wealth inequality is even further removed from this. But at least in an important statistic, which is wage inequality, we are seeing some improvement.
So we have a picture where job satisfaction is improving. Some marginalized groups in the labor force are doing better. And in fact, there is some evidence that wage inequality is being reduced. But then there are a few other questions that our audience is considering. One is whether, as a result of these present labor market conditions, could you see a situation where, given the erosion in terms of benefits for blue collar and low wage service workers, could that situation change or improve? And to what extent is the lack of benefits for these blue collar and low wage service occupations driving current shortages in those in the willingness of workers to enter those job functions?
No, that's a good question. I don't know that the growth rate in benefits for blue collar workers in recent years has been growing more slowly than higher end wages. But I think that during the Great Recession, even before that, and part of the increase in the, let's say, the non-traditional workers in recent decades was a result of the fact that companies did not want to provide the same benefits that they give high-end workers to the more lower end, and then they move them to outsourcing firms or staffing companies where benefits are indeed much less generous. I think it's a good question that we need to study more, but I wouldn't be surprised if we are seeing some turning point in that as well.
And then one final question, thinking about how benefits can be used to augment the fact that you are seeing these wage dynamics developing, is how to think about something like education benefits, where there's the potential to not only provide a benefit that workers find compelling, but also to self-select for more productive workers.
I think that's a very good idea, and I wonder if companies are actually doing this. This is something, again, we will study more.
Well, Gad and Frank, thank you. I think we've heard a lot of good ideas during the course of this webcast, and a lot of food for thought for members in terms of thinking about how to deal with labor costs in the future. And indeed, in some of our upcoming conferences here at the Conference Board, we're dealing with topics like an innovative solution for a super competitive market that play exactly into the discussion we've had on this webcast. And you may even see Gad talking about blue collar workers at some of these conferences to come. And then finally, I just want to mention a few publications related to this program and also some upcoming webcasts. So as mentioned during this program, there is the Job Satisfaction Report from last year. There is the Global Labor Market Outlook that provides a more global perspective on some of these same trends in worker shortages. And indeed, blue-collar shortages are a common theme of that report as well, from a global, not just a local perspective. And then finally, we will be having a special Windows On webcast to deal with whatever the outcome of the midterm elections is and how that's going to shape the policy environment for businesses. And then finally, please tune in to our Global Economic Outlook. That'll be on November 14th. That will be during the normal Economics Watch slot, where we're going to discuss what the key drivers of the business environment will be in the US and globally for 2019. So for Gad Lebanon and Frank Steemers, I'm Brian Shaitkin, and thank you for joining us on this special webcast.